So the way that I would define a man to be, it's someone who lives up to a social construct that heavily correlates with phenotype, aesthetics, and behaviors. That's the way I define a man.
Still don't understand what it means. I need a definition for the definition.
Well, hello there YouTube. So, I'm on edge with today's video because it's been both fun and frustrating to make it. It took me far longer than it should have to extract the essentials, first because of Steven's contradictory and nonsensical points and arguments, and then because this guy simply won't stop talking. But hey, it's here, I finished it, so now you're going to watch it. Let's start with the beginning.
So the way that I would define a man to be, it's someone who lives up to a social construct that heavily correlates with phenotype, aesthetics, and behaviors. That's the way I define a man.
Is it fair then to say that the definition of woman is exactly what the definition of man is,
Yes.
but with a woman?
Yes. Of course, people might be confused about, and that is that my definition for a man is the same for a woman. We'll unpack this later, I'm certain, but just so that I can preempt it, the work is being done on the differences of the phenotype, aesthetics, and behaviors.
Football is a physical sport that involves players who use a ball to score points and win the game within the given rules. Bowling is a physical sport that involves players who use a ball to score points and win the game within the given rules. I understand that you may be confused by the fact that my definitions for these two different sports are identical, but don't worry, work is being done on the differences of the different rules, point system, the number of players, the description of the ball, and what it takes to win the game in each sport. But if you're confused as to why I didn't detail any of these differences in my initial definitions, tough luck. The point I'm trying to make here is that Steven's definitions for men and women are not only pointless because they don't define anything, but are quite telling of Steven's understanding of the very concepts he's trying to define, which is, he doesn't have any. Because if he understood what a man and woman meant, he would have given us a clear definition that would allow us to distinguish between the two categories. If he claims that work is being done to clarify the definitions, then the definitions are implicitly unclear and worthless. Just say you can define the concepts, and that would have been fine because you would have ended up in the exact same place, but at least you would have appeared as honest and aware of the problem. But let's be fair, let's give Steven a chance to unpack his definition.
Allow me to unpack my definition. So when we look at what my definition's saying there, it's saying that a man is someone who lives up to a social construct that is typically associated with phenotype. The reason I use phenotype instead of, say, biology or physiological apparatus, such as in this case it would be testicles, is because I do not think that's actually how we've had gender roles assigned and behaved throughout history. I mean, put it this way, we didn't know about gametes until I think it was about 1700s. We didn't know about chromosomes until the beginning of the 20th century. So I think that my definition is actually the one that people have been using throughout history. It's because we didn't have access to the information to actually base it on biology.
We didn't, you're right, but now we do. Shouldn't we use the best method available to differentiate between genders, especially since you yourself have admitted that the old way was unreliable? Plus, I would add, until today, there wasn't even a need to use anything else because the phenotypes were clearly separated. So assessing the phenotype was obviously the most reliable method available to differentiate between genders. However, that's no longer the case today if you consider cross-dressing, puberty blockers, steroids, and surgical interventions that have proven very effective at blurring the differences between the phenotypes. Today, you're no longer able to tell the difference between a man and a woman simply by assessing their appearance, or if you want, it's a lot more difficult to do so. This means that today it is far more useful and necessary to use gametes and genes to differentiate between males and females, or men and women respectively. Sure, in our daily lives we still rely on assessing the person's phenotype because we don't have gamete and gene detectors in our brains to scan people on the street. But in the scientific context, we need to use the latest and most reliable method available. Unless of course you're saying that we should stick to the old method simply because that's how it's been done until today. And I don't think I need to explain Mr. Fallacy himself why that's fallacious reasoning.
Suppose that you had a culture, and what this culture did is it decided that its money was made of two alloys, or say three alloys, let's say, three alloys. And what happens is they've been spending this money, buying property, buying slaves back then, doing whatever they do with their money, right? And then what happens later is we learn, with a bit of science, the way that they understood the alloys is false. Actually, two of those are the same one. So what we've now learned is that they had a 2-alloy coin, not a 3-alloy coin, or something along this proximity, right? The question is, does that invalidate all of the purchases that happened? Or were they right? Or is money a social construct? And because it's a social construct, it really is ingrained in them, not in the external thing that they think that they're referring to.
What's that? You didn't understand the analogy? Well, you're in luck, because Stephen himself will clarify it for you and me both.
Likewise, just as they were spending this money thinking it was one way, you could say that in the past that they were assigning sex and gender based on what we now understand to be the ovaries, the gamete type, etc.
What? You're still confused? Don't worry, I totally wasn't for the first 30 times I've listened to the analogy and Stephen's subsequent explanation. So, because I already have plenty of experience in this, allow me to enlighten you. Just like people were ascribing value to the money thinking it consisted of 3 alloys instead of 2, so too they ascribed a specific sex to the person based on the phenotype, basically how a person looked. And that's because they didn't have access to science to show them that the money consisted of 2 alloys instead of 3, respectively differentiate sex based on gamete types and primary sex organs. If you can tell yet, this entire analogy is wrong, and it's wrong because he's drawing a parallel between a situation where science changes people's understanding about the nature of money, 2 alloys instead of 3, and a situation where science deepens people's understanding about the nature of sex, use biology to define it instead of phenotype. The introduction of science didn't challenge or change people's understanding of sex, it only added more nuance. It basically said using biology to determine a person's sex is more accurate than relying on phenotype. It didn't say it was wrong, it merely said that using biology is more accurate because relying on phenotype can produce false positives. Whereas in the money analogy, science came along and told people that valuing the money based on the 3-alloy composition is wrong because the money only consisted of 2 alloys, not 3. With this new understanding in place, the two situations are no longer analogous. For them to be analogous, the money analogy should have went like this. People thought money consisted of 3 alloys based on the 3 different colors that the raw materials exhibited. Then science came along and said assessing the alloy's molecular structure to differentiate between them is more accurate than relying on visuals only, because visuals can produce false positives. Naturally, the problem is that this analogy no longer does anything for Stephen because it simply reinforces a point he doesn't like, the fact that modern biology didn't in any way change our understanding of the nature of sex, but merely deepened it. It added more accuracy. No wonder neither the host nor his opponent understood the analogy or how it relates to the topic at hand.
Okay, and that analogy extends to the definition of man how?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure on the relevance of that.
Now, the following segment is very important because it sheds light, well, at least some light, on the messy and incoherent position that Stephen holds. But let's give the mic to Stephen 1 and Stephen 2.
My definition, which is someone who lives up to a social construct that's typically associated with phenotype, aesthetics, and behaviors, the word typical is put in there because they're not necessary and sufficient conditions. I don't think that there are necessary and sufficient conditions to this, just as many social constructs work this way as well.
This should be clear enough. His definitions of man and woman don't have any necessary conditions, so you don't need to have a specific hairstyle, specific behavior, specific dressing code, or any specific secondary sex characteristics to qualify as either a man or a woman. So then you might be as confused as I was when I listened to Stephen 1 and ask, okay, but how does Stephen 1 know whether a person is a man or a woman, given that his definition doesn't have any necessary requirements? Here's Stephen 1 himself answering this very question.
So then how would you classify, say, a female who just had all of the behaviors and aesthetics that we typically associate with being a biological male? Just the most masculine person you can imagine.
Yeah, so like if you had someone who had very masculine secondary characteristics, they didn't live up to the aesthetics that's typically associated with women and they didn't have the behaviors that typically associated with women, I can account for that, because I'm saying my definition is that they typically associated with this.
What would you call that person? Is that person a woman?
I'd ask them. I just go, what's your pronouns? Or I would make an assumption like yourself. Like if they really presented as masculine, like what you were saying, Peter, I would just call them a dude. And then if they correct me, I'll go, okay, thanks.
Yes, it's self-identification. You see, given that Stephen 1's definition has no necessary requirements, this means that there's nothing to contradict you if you claim you're a man, or a woman for that matter. Because Stephen 1's definition is so general and loose that it includes absolutely every single thing relating to the man and woman phenotypes, but doesn't make any of them necessary, not even secondary sex characteristics. You can see that this is Stephen 1's point clear as day when he says,
if they really presented as masculine, I would just call them a dude. And then if they correct me, I'll go, okay, thanks.
in that context, he would be wrong with respect to the person's self-identification. That's the standard he's using to assess whether he's wrong or right when assessing the person's gender. This means he not only supports the notion of self-identification, but he thinks there is no other option. A person is a woman if they claim they're a woman, whether the person meets any woman-specific characteristics or not. Okay, now let's see what Stephen 2 has to say.
But if someone came up to me and they said that they're a woman, I would assume that they're using a definition that's like the self-ID view, which is saying that there's no necessary conditions and there's not even any really descriptions at all. The self-ID view is going to want to tell you that the only thing that pertains to gender is how one identifies. And they can't even give you attributes outside of themselves, because the second they do that, they're starting to say that it's, associated with things and whatnot. That's one of the reasons I don't buy the self-identification view. The self-identification movement, what they're going to want to tell you is that gender doesn't have any necessary or sufficient conditions other than your identity. And for all of the grievances you have with that, I probably share them all, which is why I don't have that definition.
As you can see, Stephen 2 doesn't actually agree with Stephen 1 on the self-identification issue, because that would imply that there are no necessary requirements to fit either gender category. Which might confuse you, because we've just listened to Stephen 1 explain that indeed there aren't any. I don't think I need to explain the contradiction any further, right? What I do need to explain though is where the contradiction comes from. Well, it comes from the word typically that Stephen uses in his definition. So let's see what that's about.
My definition is someone who lives up to a social construct that typically associates with phenotype, aesthetics, and behaviors. And I'm not seeing where there is an issue here, because the word typical is doing a lot of heavy lifting. It's a bit like with mammals, right? We discovered the platypus. We changed the definition of mammal essentially to put typical in, because we're like, okay, there's a few exceptions. That's one of the reasons typical is involved in a lot of definitions, especially when it comes to social constructs.
Pause. It all comes from the platypus. Fortunately, this isn't the very first time Stephen has invoked this very example, and it's also not the first time that I've tackled it. So let's see what he has to say about the platypus in one of his previous videos.
Mammals were traditionally understood, at the very least, to give birth to live young. But then we went to Zeus's alpha server, Australia, and discovered the platypus, a mammal that lays eggs. Truly, the platypus is an astonishing creature, but it's still, according to Oxford Languages, a mammal. It's a warm-blooded vertebrate animal of a class that is distinguished by the possession of hair or fur, females that secrete milk for the nourishment of the young, and, typically, the birth of live young. Indeed, did you see what happened there? The word typically is allowing for the exceptions. The definition of a mammal, a fundamental category, was changed to accommodate monotremes, and yet civilization didn't crumble.
Did you notice the problem? The problem is that Stephen doesn't understand what the word typically does there. Do you see where the word typically is located? It's located right before the very last characteristic of a mammal, the ability to give birth to live young. This means that the word typically only allows an exception for that specific characteristic. It doesn't allow for an exception to all characteristics, and there are several to meet to qualify as a mammal. As you can see, these are the ability to grow fur or hair, the presence of warm blood, the vertebrate status, the animal status, and the ability to feed the young with milk produced by the mammary glands. and the platypus meets literally all of those characteristics except for the very last one, which the word typically turns into an optional feature. If this is clear, let's bring up Steven's definition of a woman to see where the problem is. You see where the word typically is placed there. It's placed before all potential characteristics. This means that the word typically allows for exceptions to all of those features. So you can qualify as a woman whether you meet all characteristics, some, or none. This means that Steven's definition of a woman has no necessary characteristics, and invoking the platypus here does nothing for his argument except for the fact that it exposes his ignorance regarding how exceptions work. The platypus example is perfect because it shows that you cannot have an exception to literally all of the requirements, because if that were the case, you would end up with absurdity. If the mammalian category had no necessary requirements, I could include anything there like insects, bacteria, fish, airplanes, and that thing that your chihuahua produces on the sofa right before you shoot it. Sure, they don't meet any of the necessary characteristics of a mammal, but that's why I put the word typically there, see? Except in that case, the category of a mammal no longer has any meaning. For the category to work, it needs to have some necessary characteristics. Because Steven's definition of a woman has none, it's meaningless, which means he has no basis for rejecting self-identification despite him claiming otherwise. And if this isn't evidence for a serious case of cognitive dissonance, I don't know what is. And if you're like me, you might be perplexed that someone you thought very highly of at some point is now supporting such incoherent and paradoxical notions. Don't be. There's a perfectly coherent explanation for it.
In The Believing Brain, Michael Shermer, the skeptic, has a chapter, Why Do Really Smart People Believe Stupid Things? They believe it because they're better at rationalizing. They're better at coming up with good reasons for bad conclusions.
To be clear, I understand that the pro-trans community defines gender and sex differently. The sex is the biological part, whereas the gender is the person's view of themselves, which may or may not align with their biological sex. My point is that trying to define gender absent of sex is virtually impossible. We've seen it here with Steven. This means that for all intents and purposes, sex and gender are synonymous, and the whole modern day debate isn't actually about the separation of sex and gender, but about the existence of gender roles and characteristics. People simply don't like the idea of gender roles and gender-specific characteristics, with everything that is implied, including social hierarchy, behavior, psychological and emotional makeup, looks, everything. And I don't think that gender roles are social constructs, at least not in the way you think. They're not social constructs in the sense of they are completely created from scratch, unrelated to biology. Instead, they are social constructs in the sense of males and females have different psychological, biological predispositions, characteristics, and drives, and gender roles are built on that understanding. In other words, we don't teach men to be providers out of thin air, but because we have observed that that's the role men tend to gravitate towards naturally. So we teach young boys to follow this path because we know that this is in the nature of men. The exact same reasoning applies to women and their tendency to be more caring and nursing. There are exceptions to all rules, I acknowledge that, but that doesn't impact the rule itself. In closing, I do agree with Steven on one point. The notion of gender should be abolished, not that of gender roles, both because we shouldn't, but more importantly, because we can't.